Alright, YouTube, it's time to talk about assimilation problems. If you play Victoria 2, you've probably had them, but Europe has them to this day. It doesn't need to be the 1800s anymore. If I were to invite you into my home, say, there's no rules, and do whatever you want, maybe I'll bend over backwards to accommodate you, here's some free money, would you feel any pressure to sort of coincide with what you thought I felt personally to be acceptable, or would you basically continue on in whatever vices and strange behaviors you may have, possibly trashing my home in the process? You'd probably do the latter. Most people would. Here's the thing. Very few people in the world have a deep-seated sort of civic nobility to them, to the point at which they feel a sort of mental pressure to assimilate into their surroundings. Some do, but not many. If I were to go to a foreign culture and wanted to reside there for any length of time, I would make an effort to learn their language, despite the fact that my foreign language skills are mediocre at best. It took me quite a while to learn what French I know. I can't even imagine something like, trying to learn the Thai language or Japanese or Russian or something like that. It'd take quite some length of time. I'd be old and gray before I'd be fully fluent, almost certainly. But most people don't do that. For most people, there'd be no deep-seated desire to assimilate unless they're being told specifically, yeah, you're going to need to assimilate in order to be part of our culture. When Europe emerged from the fires of the Second World War and decided to be pacifistic and tolerant, sort of get together and sing Kumbaya and happy rainbows and flowers and sunshine and so forth, it worked for decades. It worked as long as the people moving around Europe either felt pressure to assimilate or they were already European or something. Some people want me to talk about the Kalergi plan or whatever it is. I'll talk about that in the future, don't worry. There is a comparison and somewhat a contrast to be made between that sort of the post-nationalist ethos and what's going on in the EU today. Now, it's not entirely the same, but it does tie into it in an ideological sense, I'm sure. Here's the thing, though. The European governments not only don't really put pressure on foreign groups to assimilate anymore, they actually suppress those who think that it is a good idea actively. Attempt to censor people who do say that assimilation is not happening and should be happening. And it's not like the old waves of immigrants like the UK. There are a lot of people in the UK who came there from India, and they spoke English. Although, obviously with a Hindi-influenced accent. And they largely assimilated. I haven't heard many people complaining about the presence of people from India in the UK. I just haven't. Now, mostly they're focused on current waves of immigrants. The difference is, back when those groups were dominant in coming into the UK, assimilation was enforced. There was an understanding, yeah, I'm going to the UK because I want to make more money. I want to have a better life for my kids. I want them to get a good, first world education. There's more industry here. There's more opportunity. It's a great idea. So why wouldn't I want to be part of their culture? Now, a subculture forms. A subculture is different from the overthrow of a native culture by some sort of outside group over time. A subculture is what we have like in Boston with Irish enclaves here, or with Italian enclaves in New York City, or something like that. And it works because, they're keeping, some degree of their linguistic variant, some sort of semi-Creole of the language, with some local slang. Nobody really cares. They're keeping maybe their cuisine intact. That's actually a net positive in any nation, especially for some of these northern European states. Like, yes, I'm sure that the Norwegians in the UK are known for their fine world-class cuisine. Not entirely. I'd like to try a full English as much as anybody else, but let's be honest maybe about some of their tendencies as far as food goes. And the religion largely doesn't even matter. Some of these people coming into Europe decades ago, they're practicing Hinduism or something like that. But it never caused a problem because assimilation was expected of people. It was expected in a cultural sense, and it was definitely expected in the legal sense. At the very least, even if you want to do your own practices, however weird we may find them, you're going to follow the law. Now we've got politicians in Europe today, and indeed some here in the US, although they're a tiny minority, thankfully, and will be for some time, and hopefully always will be. You've got politicians, mainstream, establishment politicians, people like Merkel or the Swedish government or something in Europe today, saying, no, not only should we not enforce any form of cultural assimilation, because that's bigoted somehow, but we're going to bend over backwards in our legal system to shield these people from even being prosecuted sometimes. You get cases in Sweden, somebody gets raped by somebody who's not from the Swedish culture, and they say, well, I didn't know it was against the law here. And they actually give them like a suspended sentence. Well, that's crazy. They shouldn't be doing that. That's endangering more, by the way, than just the native culture. I keep having to return to this to differentiate from the somewhat small-minded argument of native culture good, outsider automatically bad. You have to look at who some of these outsiders are as well. The refugees entering Europe are being endangered on two entirely different fronts by the actions of the governments of the European Union. I don't even think they've considered this fact. They're being endangered by zealots entering Europe, who are the same people they fled from. They're being endangered by the native culture as well, because that native culture wants these groups to assimilate, to at least follow the law, and the government's not pressuring them to do so. So for every 10 immigrants to Europe that do want to obey the law, aren't really doing anything wrong, yeah, maybe a little unorthodox, maybe they don't quite speak fluent English or Polish or whatever, there's always going to be that one other person who is a total zealot. They're going to run drugs or form some sort of sex gang or something like that. It makes the entire group look like they're unlawful. And it just feeds the flames of some of the worst aspects of nationalism. When I'm talking about, oh, well, we will have sovereignty, we're going to maintain our culture. That's not, you don't even need to be a nationalist to believe that that should happen. The norm for nations for all of their history has been an outsider who comes in is expected to culturally assimilate. Subculture, fine. Keep your own slang, keep your own cuisine. That's okay. Maybe you have some practices we find odd, but if it doesn't break the law, maybe we don't care so much. Now you don't have an expectation of assimilation. So if I go to Europe today, I'm feeling little to no pressure to assimilate, unless I happen to find myself in a neighborhood overrun by people who support Front National or BNP or something like that. Or go to Eastern Europe. The Eastern Europeans don't have as much tolerance as Western Europe, which is why their cultures are still largely homogenous and intact. And good on them. That means they'll survive, honestly. The globalists of the EU think that it's a bad thing to preserve one's culture. They think there should be a European culture instead of individual European states with their own cultures. And it's causing their own overthrow. They're creating the same problems leading to their dissolution. They should have stayed with internal free movement within Europe, plus a basic sort of post-nationalist model with some very limited sort of legalistic trappings to ensure, the rudiments of human rights and so forth. If they had done that, the EU would not only be intact, it'd actually be working well. That and maybe the currency bloc would have to go. It'd have to be split up into zones or something according to the economic situation actually felt on the ground by their populations. They didn't do that. They decided to overstretch. They decided to overreach. That's their problem. They're going to fall in time. But these foreign groups that come into Europe feel no pressure to assimilate. All that has to be present is a cultural sense of the need to assimilate. You don't even need it in a legal sense. Here's the key. Europe is failing on this measure because the governments there, not only, the lesser counterpart is they don't expect other groups of people entering Europe to necessarily assimilate into the dominant culture. That's problematic, but it doesn't cause the collapse of nations. What causes the collapse of nations is that the governments there have even gone so far as to say expecting these groups to assimilate is bigotry, it's evil, and we're going to defend these foreigners, even in some cases if they're breaking our laws, from the wrath of the population and from the wrath of any legal system that may be contained there. And the EU is worse. If it weren't for the centralization of the EU attempting to crack down on nations that do attempt to enforce assimilation, it probably still wouldn't be a problem. Even if the governments themselves opposed the idea of assimilation, said, well, yeah, it doesn't really matter. You can break these minor laws. We don't necessarily have a problem. We're not going to deport you or anything. We're not going to throw you in jail. The people therein would be able to address that grievance properly, But you have this post-national authority that's not really, it doesn't listen to the people of Europe. It doesn't listen to the governments elected by the people of Europe. And so these states are just getting continuously abused. But we shouldn't really blame many of these groups that are entering Europe for not assimilating. They're not feeling any pressure to. Why would they bother? Why bother following the laws of a country that no longer has law and order? It's pointless. You're just handicapping yourself. You might as well just take advantage of that system. Most people will. Some people will refuse to. They'll stand on principle. They'll say, well, I don't feel that this is right. I'm not going to do it. Most people don't. Most will be opportunists. If there's no cultural pressure to assimilate because the governments of that country have told their people they're bigots for expecting that, then more and more people will come in, they'll settle there, and they'll say, oh, we're the masters now. You can't do anything about our presence. You can't do anything about the fact that sometimes we basically ignore the culture or the laws of this country. And you have to draw the comparison between that aspect of modern-day Western, especially Europe, and most other parts of the world. And it's not just, oh, well, the ethno-nationalists have said, oh, well, it's a case of white countries for everybody and all these other cultures get their own, nations and stuff. There are white countries that enforce assimilation too. Again, look at Eastern Europe. Look at Russia. Most of Russia, anyway. Of course, there are regions there that are populated by people that aren't white Russians. In fact, it's the tale of 4 or 5 different sort of semi-autonomous zones that are still in cooperative mode after the fall of the USSR. Here in the United States, assimilation is still expected by the majority of the culture. There's no law against stating that you believe others should assimilate. And so it's a different situation than what's had in Europe. Additionally, with Europe, these countries were built on the ethno-state principle. They were built over thousands of years. These countries were formed out of different ethnic groups, sharing common languages or religious beliefs or whatever they happened to amalgamate around, forming their cultures, often along ethnic or partially ethnic lines. That's not the way that the Americas operated. It's not the way that some of these other regions of the world operated. Well, you look at Japan. Why is Japan doing well, other than their birth rates, I guess? It's because they expect everyone who comes there to assimilate, and they strongly limit the number of people that are able to come there in the first place. It's a very meritocratic system. It's based on merit. What can you do for our country? And can you obey our laws and assimilate? If you can, yeah, maybe you're in. Otherwise, forget about it. In Europe, the threshold is essentially, can you cross the Mediterranean? Or can you get the Turks that are holding you in a refugee camp to let you across the fence? Or can you make your way across maybe through Russia or something like that? If you can get here, you can stay here. No questions asked. We're not really concerned about where you're from, what your beliefs are. We don't really have a plan in place to check these things because some of our borders are basically unprotected. And once you're in that Schengen zone, you can do whatever you want because the EU's government says so. That's the problem in Europe. The problem is a lack of expectation among the people there because they've been muzzled by their governments of assimilation. It's not even really a legal problem. It's a problem of the EU's stifling post-national authority combined with the fact that people have been sort of brainwashed, either brainwashed into thinking that it's bigoted to expect assimilation, combined with others who are simply too scared to speak out because they know that they'll get censored at the very least. They might get a knock on the door from the police, number 2. That's a problem in Europe today. And the problem's not going away anytime soon. Progress is being made. There's a Brexit. Front National is doing far better than it was before. Looking forward to the next few election cycles in any of these states, there could be a complete overthrow of the EU's authority. That takes care of the major part of that issue. As far as the EU's abuse goes, it may very well soon be over. That's about all.